Santa Barbara City Council's Finance Committee meeting for April 29th, 2014 will now come to order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on items within jurisdiction of the committee but not on today's agenda? Seeing none, let us go to the first item. Mr. Samario, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. We have two items today. The first is something we bring every quarter unrelated to the budget. It's the investment report. And then we'll follow that with the discussion of the 2015 recommended budget. But I will turn it over to Jeannie Wilson, our Treasury Manager, to talk about the first item.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson.
Chair Francisco, committee members, you have before you the quarterly investment report for the quarter ended March 31st, 2014. Not too much has changed since the last quarter update, but and that's primarily because Treasury rates remain exceptionally low. However, over the last year, the 5-year rate has actually doubled, which we would think improves our rate substantially, but it's essentially kept. We've maintained level and flat interest rate earnings, which are fairly low. Fed forecast anticipates low yields continuing in the near future. They do have some expectation that there may be some slight increases in 2015. Again, that's a guessing game. During this last quarter, we did have 11 million agency securities called or matured, and we did purchase 6 million in those securities. Our current level of LAIF balances are at 40 million. We do anticipate shifting some of those to our bank accounts for compensating balances that we will try to maintain to offset future banking fees as well, beginning in May, just come at the end of this week. Portfolio interest for the quarter, 487,000 interest earned, which is really similar to what we had last quarter. The yield is slightly down this quarter to 1.177. The next chart is just a breakdown of our portfolio. Again, 40 million in LAIF security certificates of deposit, 8 million. Treasury securities, 10 million. Our federal agencies, 91 million, and some corporate notes that we have of 12 million. That, along with our promissory note, which we reflect as an investment, and our checking account, our total portfolio is 173 or almost 174 million. The next slide will just give you an idea of where the rates have been and where they're at currently. As I mentioned, they are still low. Compared to March of 2011, they were slightly higher. They dipped down in March of 2013. As I mentioned, you can, if you can see the green bar there is the 5-year Treasury, and that was at 0.77, and that's now at 1.73 as of today, or as of end of March. So the rates still low, anticipating that they will stay fairly low, but slightly increase in the coming year. And then the final slide is just a slide of the portfolio and our maturities. I believe we talked a little bit about this at the last quarterly update, and it does show the spread of our 1-year to 5-year maturities. As I mentioned, we do have a promissory note that's out there in 2029, but and then we have not as many maturities in the 2- and 3-year time frame, which really those are the lowest rates that we've been seeing. Those have been bumping up slightly. We're going to look to level off and invest in that time frame in the next quarter. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions from the committee? Thank you very much. Next.
This is an item on consent calendar, so maybe just get approval from the committee.
Okay.
I'd move approval. Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Thank you. So the second item is a discussion of our we call non-departmental revenues. These are basically tax revenues, those that aren't associated with a specific department, such as fees and charges. We've talked about these revenues to some degree in February at our work session. We've talked about them at council. In fact, just recently on the 22nd, we did our presentation on the budget. We talked about revenues. We just always think it's a good idea for the finance committee to hear the same report, but we go into more detail. And we want you to understand what our assumptions are, the basis for what we're projecting this year and for next year, and to give you a chance to sort of, give us feedback whether you think they're reasonable assumptions, that they're too aggressive, not aggressive enough. Ultimately, we want to have a recommendation from the committee to council that you recommend that we go with these estimates based on current year projections and next year's growth rates assumptions. So that's the purpose of that, and we're going to close out after this presentation from Ms. Wilson. I'll give you a detailed version of our multi-year forecast. You saw that on Tuesday, which just showed two lines going, sort of across. But I'll let you see the details, and we'll go over some of the assumptions we've used to build that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. As Bob mentioned, we're going to talk overall major revenues. This is essentially sales tax, property tax, TOT, and then some discussion on UUT, franchise fees, business license, and property transfer tax. Just as an overview, the revised projected revenues for FY14 are estimated to exceed the originally adopted budget by $1.6 million, and I'll go into detail on what comprises that number. And then the revised forecast for 2015, we see an increase of $2 million from the preliminary budget that was adopted last year. And for 2015, we're estimating about a 3.5% increase overall in revenues. This is a detailed slide of those major revenues, and the first column is our actuals for 2013 and what our budget as adopted for these revenues were, which was about $76.3 million. With our reforecast, as I mentioned, that's $1.6 million increase in our estimated reforecast, and that's again because we have more current information and revenues received to date. We're able to further analyze these figures and come up with $77.9 million, again, an increase of 1.6 that we're estimating with these revised projections. For 2015, that bottom line increase is $2 million, and essentially when we increase 2014, which becomes the base for 2015, we take advantage of that increase on top of any reassumptions we make for 2015 as well. So they're attached. Your handouts are of the slide presentation, and then the last three handouts in your packet are actual the schedules that we use for sales tax, property tax, and TOT in a little more detail. So the sales tax before you, what you'll see is I mentioned we adopted a growth rate of 3.5%, and we're actually trending a little bit above that. Looks a little misleading because it looks like we're going to fall below our budget, adopted budget. But again, when we put our budget estimates together each year, we revise the current year, and then we build on that revised number. So if our actuals don't come in at that revised projection, then we're starting with a lower base. So in this case, we didn't meet our projection last year for sales tax in 2013. Although we met our adopted budget, we didn't meet our projected budget. And therefore, although we're still doing fairly well, we're just about $94,000 projected under budget at the end of this year. And we've reforecast 2015 at 3.5%, and we're just about $100,000 below that preliminary number. So some of the assumptions that we used in coming up with those projections, we've updated our sales tax figures for based on receipts through the first 2 quarters of the year, and we essentially project the same type of increases for the remaining of the calendar or the fiscal year at the level that we adopted with the budget, and again resulting in $94,000 estimated to come under. We don't see a huge bump in sales tax, just a steady growth in sales tax. So our figures are closer to what they were at our peak in in 2007 and 2008. Here's a analysis or a trend that you can see for the last number of years since '08, when we had our highest figures. We see that sales tax dipped in '08, '09, and '10, and then started trending up. A bit of a higher peak in 2012, but we're looking at them leveling off. If you can look at 2013, we were at 3.3% growth. 2014, we're estimating that at 4.3%. So I think we're very comfortable projecting 2015 at a 3.5% growth rate. And next, we'll move into property tax. Property tax, we saw the most significant difference to adopted budget in property tax, and that's at over $784,000. Pretty significant number. And it's a good number. The county provides the city with evaluation and assessment reports each September, October timeframe of each year for what they will be remitting to the city for that year. So these are good numbers. What you'll see is that the valuation or the assessed valuation increases were much greater than we had originally estimated. We based on the county's data, that's at 4.3%. And so our original estimates of, I believe were just about 2.2%. So we've essentially doubled what we thought we were going to do. The adopted growth rate at the bottom there, you can see, was 1.9, or just about 2%. So based on the county's figures, we've calculated our increased and difference to adopted budget by $784,000. Again, compounding that to 2015, we're looking at $1 million more in 2015 than we originally budgeted, or our preliminary budget as of last year.
Ms. Wilson, what's the story with the RDA piece of that?
The RDA piece of that, it's reflected separately. Let me go back. That number stays pretty constant from the projections that we've received from the county, but essentially now that we don't separate RDA funds to the RDA, the general fund gets a portion of those monies. So we've kept that amount projected at the same level.
I guess my question is, so why is the revised growth almost 15%? The reason I ask is I would have thought that would probably be one of the most predictable parts of the
first year in 2013, we got some cleanup payments from the prior year. So you can see that figure is 1.8. The 1.541 is a good number from the county. So there were some one-time payments that we received, and it was pretty much that transition year.
Okay.
And so that should be a very solid figure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Sure. Mr. Hart.
Why did the county admin fees go down? That's a good thing. Not complaining, but didn't surprise
It possibly could be because the prior year numbers that we received from them were a little bit larger. Or do you know an answer?
Sure.
Okay.
So it turns out that the county had been overcharging us, and counties across the state were overcharging cities for property tax administration fees. It had to do with the fact that when the triple flip occurred and we started getting property taxes in lieu of some sales taxes, that they used that as a basis or reasoning to start charging more admin fees, even though the work really didn't change, just sort of the basis changed. And so there was a court decision that found that they shouldn't have been charging that. So we got a refund. That was part of the one-time money we got last year in 2013 that we reprogrammed. It was about $1.5 million we got back, or maybe $1 million. I don't remember the number, but prospectively now they're reducing to an appropriate level those admin fee charges to about 200 and some thousand. They used to be closer to 400,000.
And they do actually provide us that figure as well, so we shouldn't see a surprise in that the number for FY14.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, the AV increase was 4.3. We're looking at an increase from the adopted budget of $784,000. We're assuming a growth rate of 3% for next year. It could be higher. It's difficult to tell, but we bumped up, our projections at 3% versus the 2% that we had for 14 initially. So we're confident with that figure and comfortable with that figure. And again, that at those rates, we're looking at about $1 million more in from the preliminary estimate that was provided last year. We are also working with the county and have had some discussions to try to get a little bit more analysis from them. They provide a lot of data on a county-wide basis for assessed valuation county-wide. We're hoping to be able to get information that sections out City of Santa Barbara so that, although we get revised and accurate information from them in September, October every year so we can revise our budget, we'd like to get forecasting information a little bit more sooner from them since they have the data. Not sure if they have the resources. I've had some discussions with them already, but it is something we're pursuing.
So are you saying that they're not breaking out the data within the City of Santa Barbara?
They break out the data later in the year when, as I mentioned, we've already adopted our budget, so they'll give us that information. But as far as prospectively or doing it sooner, they haven't really done that yet. And they have a lot of information on valuations by section, by Prop 8, maybe adjustments. And we're just trying to see if they could maybe give us information a little sooner and break it out from their county-wide database.
Just if I can add to that,
Sure.
What we're particularly interested in is we know that they're essentially limited to 2% or CPI, whichever is less. But the part that we have some potential, we believe, is this Prop 8 recapture where properties have been assessed lower than what they were under Prop 13. And they can recapture those at whatever rate they feel is appropriate based on market values returning. They're not limited to the 2% or the CPI and those that recapture. So the detail they provide for us on a countywide basis is how much of the 4.3, like this current year, is CPI versus how much of that is from a Prop 8 recapture. And we're trying to get that just for our city and also have conversations with them to see, well, what's your plan for the next few years? Are you planning on being aggressive, not aggressive? What's your sort of overall approach so we can have a better idea of how to project the next few years, because CPI is going to be CPI. And in fact, they've told us next year CPI is going to be less than 1%. So for us, what's the potential for recapturing some more under Prop 8? So our assumption of 3% is sort of recognizing CPI is going to be very low, but assuming that they're going to be picking up some of the Prop 8 assessment increases and therefore property tax revenues to us. We just don't know. So we're trying to work with them to get more information in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Again, here's an analysis from 2008 to current of our increases in property tax. And they range from back in 08 of 6.6%, 2013 7.6%, and what we originally, our growth was estimated, or what we budgeted originally was 2.9%, but we're seeing that closer to 4.3%. Okay. TOT, so probably be the most involved analysis that I'll give you. We do update TOT through the most current months. In this schedule, it's through February. And we project the remaining months. And in doing so, we estimated almost $400,000 additional revenue than what we initially adopted. Partly in due, if you look at the schedule, December, January, and February, and even November, you'll see some significant double-digit growth. We call that the great weather adjustment, because we don't anticipate that we can count on this every year. If you look at the prior year, those same months, you'll see that the percentages are quite different. So we know we had great weather. We know the rest of the country didn't have such great weather. So we're attributing a lot of that increase to that fact. So what we're doing when we reforecast is we do reforecast another significant difference to preliminary budget of over $500,000. But in going through this analysis, we did discount for those months a little bit. So we don't build on that actual great weather month that we had for the months of November through January and February. We discounted those months a little before we built on our estimates, and I'll go through that in a little more detail.
Question.
Sure, Mr. White.
When did the Orient Express kick in?
I'm not sure.
April.
Is that the?
April 2013.
Okay. Is that Ellen Conto?
Yeah.
Okay. So in addition to 2014, the percentage revised growth rate was at 13%. That's significantly high, and that's because of that hotel. We had estimated initially when we adopted the budget about a 5% growth rate, and then on top of that, we layered the opening of that new hotel. So we won't see double-digit growth next year because that hotel will already be built into that base figure.
What about the Santa Barbara Inn? When does
That we
come
also
back on?
factored the fact that they were closed most of this year, or will be 9 months out of this year, and then we layered that into next year's by month. Maybe not at 100%, but so we took each year, deducted what we knew we weren't going to get, and then we added back what we know we will get on top of that base. So for 2014, with the revised projections, just under $400,000 from adopted budget, we looked at current year activity through February. We included a full year of Ellen Conto in that growth. We saw significant increases in TOT for December through February. So the overall revised growth rate is 13.1, and I believe last year it was at 10.2 or something like that. We don't anticipate that occurring again next year, so we've made some adjustments. So for 2015, we assumed a base growth rate of 6%. We made some adjustments for those temporary hotel closures on a month-by-month basis. And then we did back out a factor for the great weather that we believe is an anomaly for this year. It'd be great if we have it again next year, but we don't count on that. If we built the budget based on those figures, we might be in some trouble. Plus, we want water next year, right? We want rain. So overall, our growth rate is 5.7 for 15, and that results in an increase to the preliminary budget of over $500,000. Good. And here's your historical information, and you can see that TOT's significantly bumped up since 2008. We've had some additional hotels, and we've just had a really strong year as well in 2014. Some other major revenue categories: utility users tax, franchise fees, business license, and property transfer tax. These are not as significant as the other revenues as far as growth goes. They've been a little bit more stable. I'll go through them one at a time. Utility users tax, we did do a revised projection based on activity through March. So to date, we're looking at about $255,000 increase over adopted budget. This is mainly as a result of increased gas and electric UUT. That number can fluctuate based on what we receive April, May, and June of this year. So we'll keep a close eye on that. And then we assume a growth rate of 2% for next year in 2015, and that results overall in a $260,000 over our preliminary budget estimate. Franchise fees, fairly level as well. Slight increase over adopted budget of $76,000, and in 2015, $77,000 over budget. Fairly level, again, 2% growth rate. Business licensed, we've got a revised projection of 6.9, an increase of about $92,000 over adopted budget, and we kept that growth rate of 2% for the coming year as well. Historically, here's some numbers for business license to show that we have seen a bump up in business licenses for the years of 2013, 14, and then we're going to assume they're going to stay level. We did implement an audit program with business license 2 years ago, so you could attribute the increases in 2013 and in 14 of 6% to the new businesses that company has identified for us. They are paid on a contingency basis, so they do identify businesses using their database resources, and we get further compliance with our business license program, and they get paid based on the findings that they receive. That is now leveling off, we believe, so we're looking at 2015 staying somewhat level thereafter.
Could you describe in a little more detail exactly how they're paid?
They are paid on a finder's fee basis, and if I'm not mistaken, is it 40% or 25%? 40%, I believe. Good job. So they identify businesses, they send out the notices, they send us regular reports on what they've identified. We do work with them if there are complaints or disagreements on whether or not their information is accurate. We do also work with them on waiving penalties or those types of fees if, in fact, there appears to be a legitimate reason why maybe the business didn't know or was not in compliance for some reason. So they are in regular contact with staff. They do mass mailings, I believe, during at least portions throughout the year, but maybe twice a year they'll do a mass mailing on businesses that they have found. They'll do an initial notice, a second notice, and a third notice. They do calculations of what they estimate the taxes will be based on the information they have and applying the right category to that business. They'll do calculations of penalties based on when they believe the business was initiated. And if those businesses disagree, they do contact the city, and we can confirm those types of items that they have disagreement with, whether or not they're in the right category or not, which affects their bottom line, whether or not they have been in business as long as the consultant believes they've been in business, which affects how much they owe us. And in some cases, we have the ability to waive penalties if it's warranted as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I guess
Mr. Hart.
this is as good a place as any to have a conversation about the art community. I know Councilmember White is in contact with folks because he has relatives who are artists, and I do as well. And so gotten a lot of information, a lot of emails, very concerned folks who apparently, because I think some folks were identified through the audit process and asked to pay their business license fees. And I think in the instance that I'm aware of, they actually got a discount through working through the city staff process from what they originally were assessed. But there does seem to be just a lot of information gap in regards to what artists, I think the law is fairly clear that, if you sell art in the city of Santa Barbara, if you live in the city of Santa Barbara and you make art and you sell art, you need to have a city business license, and there's 2 tiers of those licenses. I think there's about a $100 fee and $31 fee, depending on what your art level of profitability is. But I just fundamentally think that we need to take a proactive communication strategy to explain what's actually going on, because I think that what's happening is classic email chain stuff where somebody says something that they state as fact that isn't necessarily fact, that gets distorted by another email, by another email, to the point where, folks are thinking that there is some kind of connection between our city business license and the IRS and audits, and, people are just very, very scared and fearful and acting on that fear. And so I think we need to get ahead of that and really figure out a plan to communicate directly to the Art Association and all the other various art organizations in the community about what exactly, the business license is and who has to pay it, and, why this has happened, and probably be open to some flexibility about past fees. The reality of the situation from what I see is there, are people who make a living selling art, and then there are lots and lots of people who make art who hope to sell paintings that may or may not sell paintings. And so that's the range of people you're dealing with. And there's a lot of sensitivity, I think, involved in this, and not a lot of revenue amongst the people that are particularly sensitive about this.
Right.
Thank you.
Because we have, excuse me.
Yeah, and just to pile on, the First Thursday experience has really revolutionized this. We now have participation that's exploded. And how does that, and again, there may be, I know that I don't know how it works. So if I don't know how it works, then no doubt the artist who's, got a few pieces showing up in one or another of the bookshop or the gallery or the mayor's office, how about the kid who's the fifth grader who gets $25? Where is that? And I think it's important, as Mr. Hart is saying, to frame it, and that's a bad word, anyway, to lay it out in a way that everybody understands what's going on. And I know we have one person here to testify on this topic today, too, so perhaps as long as we're having the conversation, we might have that testimony while we're on the topic, Mr. Chair. That'd be you.
Actually, I was going to pass this out.
Go right ahead.
Let me pass out. This is going to the city council meeting, but since you'll all be there.
Sure. And actually, why don't you have a seat over here? And if you could state your name for the record,
My
please.
name is Doreen White,
Thank you.
and I'm a local artist. I belong to Santa Barbara Art Association, Goleta Valley Art Association. I'm on the board of Southern California Artists Painting for the Environment, and I'm an associate artist with the California Art Club. I've been hearing about this partly because SCAPE is a artist organization doing shows for nonprofits, and we've raised over $100,000 for environmental nonprofits. And yet, our artists are getting scared to enter our shows. We have 3 shows coming up this year in Santa Barbara, and there isn't much clarity. I called the business license office, and they said that if you sell a painting on consignment, you need a business license. Now, when I studied the law, as much as I know, I sat in the law library yesterday with a little bit of help. And a painting sold on consignment, from what I understand, is not a direct sale. And the gallery or the association, like we have our beneficiaries handle the sales, they deal with the sales tax. And yet the artists are being told they need to have a license for this. Hutton House recently told their artists they had to have a license. Some of these people, one woman had never sold a painting. It is really sad because she's never sold a painting before. So she put everything up not for sale. Other people just withdrew their art. Manny Lopez at Gallery 113 said there's a big drop in Santa Barbara Art Association members. People are dropping out. People are pulling out of the gallery, even though the gallery handles the sales. And the people putting the paintings in there shouldn't be targeted for a business license. I looked at quite a few other things. There is also a city, I went through quite a bit. There's a city law on the books that $1,200 or less, you don't pay a sales tax. You don't do a business tax. I got it referenced here. Under legality, it's 5.04.730. And so a lot of these artists who have been asked and fined don't make that much. And yet, there's artists I've talked to who I don't know if they want to be known by name on the record, but they were sent a bill by Muni Services, a very austere bill. One woman is a property owner. She was afraid there'd be a lien put on her house if she didn't rush down and buy a business license, and yet the only time she sells in Santa Barbara is at an art gallery. And she was fined, I think, over $500. Another couple went to, they got a notice from the Santa Barbara Art Association about this. They immediately went down to the business tax license place. And the woman, she was initially billed $730, and they reduced it by $100. You're saying you get a reduction? Well, it was a minor reduction. Her husband was billed $275 because he had shown at the Architectural Foundation last year. This woman didn't sell $630 worth of paintings last year. They're both retired couples. They love art. As she said, She's an artist. She has to create. She wants to be part of the creative energy of Santa Barbara. So she wants to put her work out there. I really think a lot of the ways that the criteria are a little bit shaky. For instance, I noticed there was one that if you have a website and you deliver a painting to Santa Barbara, you should have a city license. And I question whether only local artists, Santa Barbara, Goleta, Montecito, Carpinteria, are being targeted for that, or whether the whole country is going to be targeted. I mean, if somebody sells a painting on eBay and ships it to Santa Barbara, do they need a city license? I mean, there's some aspects of the criteria that I feel are very shaky. I'm going to be at the council meeting today, but I think for my feeling, to get the artists feeling good about Santa Barbara again, there's a feeling of withdrawal right now. There's a feeling of Santa Barbara's after us. They're hunting us. There's elderly artists who are just backing away. There's people who are scared to bring their art to Santa Barbara. And you know, I look at the budget last week, and you know, $2.5 million towards arts promotion and programs, and then, you know, for this little amount of business license, you're going to chase the artists off.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, thank you very much for that. And it sounds like we need to provide some clarity on what the rules here actually are, so that there's not so that it's quite clear to people.
Yeah,
what the
and the
rules are.
rules need to, I question whether all of them are compliant with the law.
And we need to check that for sure.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to mention the other thing, but I'm going to make a recommendation that a group of artist representatives, business representatives, downtown Santa Barbara, the art associations, the Arts Commission, and maybe the Finance Committee get together and try to work out whether they want to be maybe like Los Angeles, where there's a creative artist exemption.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As a follow-up, I did have a couple of conversations with our consultant and found that they had recently done a mass mailing of all businesses, not targeting just artists, but their normal program and routine. So a number of letters went out in the months of March and April. Specifically with regard to artists, I've requested a list of who those letters went out to, so we can start putting together an outline and framework of what applies, what doesn't apply, because in their mass mailing, they may have identified artists that don't need to pay, but until we hear back, we're not going to know. And that's generally how it works. But in this case, by getting the detailed information from them, reevaluating the criteria as it's currently stated in the ordinance, and reaching out to those individuals with more clear information, we can do another mailing to those specific artists, and in some cases, you know, remove some of the concern and the fear, because maybe they don't even apply or don't need to obtain a business license, or those figures that were provided to them in that letter on how much they owe may not even be relevant. So we have started that process, and we'll work on it quickly, because it does appear that they've created some confusion and out there in the community.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I guess just as one thing, maybe, because I do think this email thing is going faster than maybe the time for letters and everything. So maybe if we could just get with the Art Association and have something simple go out to everybody through the email, just saying, we're well aware of this situation, we're looking into it, we're going to have, you know, a good communication going forward, and work together to figure out, you know, the best way to get everybody to have the information they need. I just worry about, you know, taking the time to be thorough. We need to do that, but we also have something where I think fear is escalating by the hour. I think I got these first emails maybe last Thursday. Yeah, and here we are. This is only Tuesday, and the city was closed Friday. So there's a snowball effect happening, and it'd be great to head that off before people start taking their art out of galleries and things like that, because it certainly is not the intention of the city. I mean, I think the context for anybody who's listening is that, as you said, this is a regular program that applies to all businesses. This is not a targeted effort aimed at artists. And there's definitely probably some miscommunication from the consultant talking to all businesses about that. First of all, there's a different price level for artists that probably was not communicated in that first letter. And I think that's fundamental to this conversation, the $31 fee versus the $100 fee on an annual basis. And then I guess just from my perspective, I'd be open to some flexibility about going backwards in time. Again, this is not a significant revenue source. You know, if people want to buy, one thing I would hate is for people who want to buy a business license and do this right and want to pay $31 to not be afraid to come and contact the city and do that out of fear that they're going to get assessed back business fees and things like that. I don't know that that makes any sense for anybody. But that's my thoughts.
I just wanted to say that I think we agree that's a good idea, getting ahead of it, or at least trying to respond quickly with that. We're working on this. And I know, Mr. Hart, you weren't here, but a couple of years ago, we started, maybe 3 years ago, we did sort of the same thing, but with vacation rentals, because we know that there have been a lot of them out there who were not complying, and we thought they should. And so we created an amnesty program that said, if you come forward, get a TOT certificate, but also business license, then you only owe us 1 year's worth of taxes, no penalties. And that encouraged folks to come forward, and we got a lot of them who came on. So that's one approach we could potentially use, but I agree we should have some flexibility, and we will with that.
Okay.
That covers business license historical. The last category, property transfer tax. We've kept that revenue fairly level. We do anticipate a $98,000 increase over adopted budget, and we're assuming a 1% growth rate for 2015. It is difficult to estimate this tax category because it's based on property sales activity, and we don't forecast that. So that essentially will keep that that revenue stream fairly level. Overall, just long-term growth rate assumptions that we're looking at for these categories. We did see, as I mentioned, in 2014, some fluctuating higher growth rates. But when you look at 2015 and forward, we do forecast those leveling out. And again, some of this information is based on historical trends. So we may have seen a blip in 14 and even in 13, but we can't assume that continued level, or it's not quite as sustainable if you look at it on a historical basis. And that's it for major revenues. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions from the committee? Thank you.
Okay. So I have provided you a copy of the multi-year forecast. It's the 8.5 by 14 sheet. A lot of detail here. And again, this was the document we used. We pulled just the key numbers in order to provide to the council on the 22nd the two lines, the line chart that showed the revenue and expenditure lines over a 5-year period, representing our projections. I just wanted to highlight a few things. One is, in the context of revenues, the tax category at the top section of the first page is really what drives a lot of our assumptions and obviously provides most of the money for spending. So those assumptions are important to us. Jeannie kind of went over our assumptions for this year, projections, and next year. But I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that when we make projections, particularly with things like sales taxes, TOT, and to some degree property taxes, they're highly driven and tied to economic conditions, and it's really hard for us to predict that. So when we make longer-term projections or even medium-term projections, we always look back to what have been the historical trends and historical averages. We don't try to rely on 1 year's data to say, well, geez, bed tax is up at 13%, so therefore we should be assuming 13%. We have to kind of rely on what have been the longer-term trends. So when you look forward for the taxes, you can see that overall, they're pretty moderate. They're neither too high nor too low. They just tend to be kind of in the middle because that's where we think it's appropriate. We don't try to sort of guess where the economy is going to be. there's probably a good chance in some cases that the revenues will be better than this, but in some cases there's a chance they'll be less than this. But I just wanted to sort of highlight in more broad terms that the taxes category, which represents about 70% of our overall revenues, we make those kinds of assumptions going forward, try to be sort of in the middle, not too aggressive, but not too conservative either. And on a long-term basis, we tend to be pretty good. We're never going to be right on it. If you can pick one year, we'll be wrong potentially by a lot. But we look for sort of longer-term trends. And with all the other revenues, a lot of them are just departmental revenues, so we kind of assume a CPI factor, whether it's 1%, 2%, or 3%. So we don't spend a lot of time forecasting forward what those numbers are going to be, other than just assuming that they're going to go up by 2 or 3%. So if you turn to the page to the back, this is, if you see toward about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see what we believe to be the net gain or loss starting this year projected all the way through 2018. It's just below the line that says total expenditures. And for this year, and I'm sorry, I didn't put this on the screen because it's too much detail, but this year, for example, we're assuming we're going to end the year based on our current projections, $2.6 million to the good, so a surplus of $2.6 million. That is before our capital program. This year, we're expecting to spend $1 million for capital, so that the net after capital was 1.5, which is still very good. And in the old days, prior to 2006, we used to fund our capital program from reserves, because we had reserves typically above policy, and we always had some better than expected results. And so we funded essentially our capital program from prior year surpluses, but essentially from reserves. But this year, because our reserves are so tight, starting about 4 or 5 years ago, we said we can't use reserves anymore for capital. We have to build it into our ongoing sort of budget, fund it from revenues. So this comes off the bottom or the top. So it does leave a surplus of 1.5. And then, as you know, our current policy now provides that any surplus that we get, half goes to capital and half then falls to the bottom line to build up our reserve balances. So going across on that net increase decrease, which is after capital, you can see that the number grows in 16, at least on a projected basis, to almost $2.4 million. And then it starts to go down to 1.9 and ultimately to $1.2 million in 2018. We've talked about this, a lot of factors involved, retirement costs going up, particularly starting in 16, so that's why that gap is narrowing. But it's still a surplus. The one thing I also want to highlight is just before that row is you'll see that our capital program is growing from 2014 of $1 million to $1,550,000 in 2018. That was a conscious decision we made to bump up every year by about $250,000 or $100,000, excuse me, our capital program that we're building into our budget. So most recently we've been at about $1 million, maybe a little more. But historically, we've had a closer to $2 million capital program. So we've sort of made an assumption that we are going to ramp that capital program up, in addition to whatever we generate through surpluses that goes for capital as well. So it really is saying we're going to be committing a lot more dollars than historically we've had, at least in the recent history, to capital. And recognizing that sort of takes away then from what we're going to be leaving in reserves and all that. But that's sort of, I want to point that out because that's an important part of our assumptions, because if we were to leave capital $1 million, these numbers would change, obviously. And then at the very bottom, just the last thing I'll highlight on this is the fact that even with these surpluses, our reserves relative to what our policies say should be are still not fully funded. So at 14, we're going to be $3 million below where we should be, and in 18, about $3.5 million. So the gap sort of widens, but it's because we're sort of chasing a growing number. 25% of our reserves of our operating budget is how we calculate the required reserves, and since our budget is growing every year, we're having to commit that much more to reserves. If you look at the expenditures, total expenditures above, you can see that in 2014, they're $110 million, but by 2018, we've added almost $15 million, so 25% of that is what we have to add to reserves just to keep even. So, I think it's good news because we're essentially going to be ending in 2018 with almost $33 million of reserves, so a lot of cash. Even though we're slightly below where we should be in terms of our policies, I think we still have a lot of cash to deal with an emergency, and I think at some point we're going to get there. We're going to close the gap because we might do better than this. I'm hoping we do better than this, but at least we're not losing ground in that respect. So that's really what I wanted to highlight. These are the details. Obviously you can look at it in more detail if you like, but this was the basis for our projections. We do factor in some salary increases into these numbers, not only what we project to be our retirement cost increases that PERS provides us, but we do assume that starting in 16, that salary increases would be, 17 and 18, we would have a 3% salary increase to all groups across the board, and through 16, it's a 2% increase. So that's the assumption we build on. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on that, well, first of all, I learned something today that, again, each year I hope I learn something, and that is the business about the capital being at $2 million, 2006 or whatever. So that's, and obviously, $2 million of 2014 dollars would be probably $2.4 million, or in other words, even a bigger number than that. So while we're still chasing our reserves and we're almost keeping up, we're not chasing our capital anywhere near even as well as we're chasing our reserves. So that's, it's a problem that we're talking about in a variety of ways, infrastructure and such like, but that's clearly a major concern area. That's for a system of this scale, that's a completely inadequate number. And I know there are other ways that the capital gets funded, but for a stated number, no company would even consider having a capital program of $1 million on a third of $1 billion system. It isn't right.
I just want to clarify, though, this is just the general fund capital, so we're looking at a $110 million budget.
Okay, the 100.
Citywide, the capital number is much bigger.
Okay, all right, I stand corrected on that, but still there are libraries and fire stations and police headquarters and a whole parks buildings. So there's a lot of infrastructure there to deal with that budget. So that's, again, it's a concern area. And secondly, I know that you're doing this. We've seen it already in the material you've presented. But I just think it continues to need to be highlighted that we're separating out one of the big growth numbers, which is the retirement costs, which you mentioned, but it's not broken out as the salaries are going, even our staff can look at it and see, they're getting a mere 3% increase in salary, but the cost of that staff is going up by 10%, or it's a substantially bigger number than the 3%. So again, while I know that you're bringing it out often, I just think that education is going to continue to be something for all of us to keep in mind. So the more you highlight it, the more I appreciate it. Sure.
Mr. Hart?
Well, I think my take on the conversation about reserve policy versus capital investment is that, and this is just talking off the top of my head, I haven't thought it all the way through, but maybe it speaks to the reserve policy needs to be looked at. If we're essentially saying we can't meet reserve policy because we're instead, wisely, I think, investing in capital, whereas we could actually probably meet reserve policy if we didn't invest in capital. And then we would be, from that point on, we would be able to use surpluses like we did in the old days to address capital. We'd lose that year's investment in capital by doing that, but we would be meeting reserves at that point. Now, the problem is that we're always chasing reserves as revenues increase, and that, I think, that's probably the fundamental issue, is that, is there a point where 25% of the general fund is more than is necessary for reserves? What is maybe we need to have some really basic questions about what are reserves supposed to do and how are they supposed to be there, and because it doesn't seem clear to the public if we're never meeting reserve policy and not adequately investing in capital. Obviously, we have a revenue problem. That's the real issue, but and we have to have that conversation. But we're sending a lot of interesting messages that I don't think they're clear to people. Is the impression that I'm getting from it. And I see Mr. Armstrong.
I'll give you a couple observations. I think that the finance department has been somewhat conservative, as I think we expect them to be. And what I expect will happen, like has happened the last 3 years, is that we'll do better than budget by $1.5 million a year, which is what we did this year and what we did last year. And what that means is that half of that will go to capital, which will enhance the capital, and half of it will drop to reserves. If you recall the reserve bar chart we showed you, I think, last Tuesday, we've actually picked up $7-8 million in reserves, most of it in the middle of the recession, because we were conservative and controlled cost. And so I'm feeling, although this is what I would say we're never going to get to our 25%, I wouldn't be surprised if we get there in the next 3 years or so, and still with a pretty healthy capital budget. And so I'm not that concerned about it, because I think we need to be conservative, because one of these years we're going to have a recession, and everything's going to go flat for a year or two. And the only way to be prepared for that is to be somewhat conservative. The other caution I want to give you, and that is if you look on fiscal year 15, where you've got the net increase, $1,023,000, is I'm expecting that the council is going to want to use some of that money at the end of the process to supplement programs, restore things, add police officers, grounds maintenance, give money to, arts groups. So just remember, though, when you do that, especially if it's for ongoing funding, is let's say you take $500,000 of that and you put it towards ongoing programs, is that number then becomes lower, and then every year on the out years also is the same number plus inflation. And so that will, I think, have as much of an impact on how this multi-year flows as if you, with anything, because if there's just like the state legislature is having this discussion, we've got all this money, let's spend it right away. My caution is just be careful, because then that does affect everything every year. And so the $500,000, then that's $2 million over that 4-year time frame. Then it's not available for reserves and for capital. That's my actual bigger fear than that we're never going to get there.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. White.
And at the point to Mr. Hart is to go back to your previous round of work here. If you go to 2004, I mean, your comment earlier was that the city had reserves at policy and more. So that was your earlier experience.
Right.
But 2004,
Right. No,
the raid began.
Yep.
And so what we're still working on now is recovering from the loss of the 90% of the rainy, not the emergency reserves, but the rainy day reserves. So that's the as we're sitting here talking about this, that is one of the besides the retirement, besides the pensions, that's another one of those deficits that we're working on, and also, of course, we missed that money when it really kind of would have been there.
And
Chair.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we had here on the Finance Committee a very thorough discussion of the reserve policy, partly in response to that, having gone into the recession with drastically reduced reserves and wanting to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the more insight into that's that conservative, that there is a path. Because, looking at the numbers, you just go, we're permanently $3 million below reserves, but we're increasing capital. And so we're making that choice, and that's the smart choice, I think. But if we can have both, then that's the better outcome. But it's still inadequate investment in capital. So that's the big problem for us, fundamentally.
Okay. Mr. Samario, do we need a recommendation to council on this?
No, this is just informational purposes only.
Okay, very good.
Right.
In that case, if there's no further discussion, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.